This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who is the former U.S. ambassador to the European Union and currently serves as the Special Advisor for Holocaust Issues, and is Senior Counsel at Covington Burling LLP. They discuss modern diplomacy in America, ranging from Vietnam to the JCPOA, Henry Kissinger's diplomatic legacy, and his new book entitled The Art of Diplomacy.
Ambassador Eizenstat, welcome to the show.
Roger, it's a really great professional and personal pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a thrill for me. As our viewers and listeners might know, I worked in law prior to coming to the Reagan Institute, and one of the great thrills of working at Covington and Burling was having a chance to work with and get to know you, Stu. I always admired and appreciated the time you gave me back when I was starting out the law firm, and
I have to say, I go back to your wonderful father, Dove, as well.
Well, we appreciate that. He, of course, was a veteran of the Reagan administration, so his name comes up from time to time. But really excited to have you on the show, and having served at senior positions during the Carter administration, of course, where you're the domestic policy advisor, and then multiple senior roles during the Clinton administration, of course, ambassador to the EU, and of course, other jobs in commerce and state and treasury. It makes perfect sense to me that at this moment you've come out with your latest book called The Art of Diplomacy. So congratulations on this great accomplishment and how American negotiators reach historic agreements that change the world. Very interesting way you approached this discussion about negotiators and really covering so much of the landscape of significant events in U.S. history, diplomatic history. Stu, just give us a sense of why you came to write this book, and the organization is quite interesting to me as well. Maybe comment on that. You look at it, negotiations through the lens of the United States and national security, the United States as a mediator, the United States at war, and then the United States in multilateral negotiations, which I think are a great way kind of covering the landscape of different ways negotiation comes into play in diplomacy. So tell us about the organization of the book, more broadly, what brought you to write this book.
We are living at a turbulent time when the world is beset, Roger, with challenges and conflicts seemingly incapable of positive resolution. And so I wanted to write a book that showed not just practitioners, but the public, how U.S.-led diplomacy over the last 50 years has actually been successful in many areas in resolving problems, to give us some credibility for doing so for the ones we face now. Second, with the hot wars going on as we speak in Gaza and Ukraine, and with having lived through more than 50 years of conflicts from Vietnam through Afghanistan and Libya, and of course now with Gaza and Ukraine, I wanted to take a hard look at the use of military force as an instrument in diplomacy. When should it be used? How should it be used? How can it be effective? What can we learn? And third, and this is something that, if I may say, directly relates to Ronald Reagan and the Reagan Institute, and that is, I am very concerned that we're entering in a period of isolationism, not unlike that in the 1930s, which produced the Second World War. And Ronald Reagan was a great internationalist. So I wanted to write this book to show what we can and must do going forward internationally to avoid isolationism and to avoid creating a vacuum in which Russia and China, with a very different set of values and interests, will fill all too readily. So that was the thinking behind the book. And with the 130 interviews, I didn't want to make it an academic book per se, although there are multiple books and articles and sources. I wanted to put people, as James Baker said in the in his preface, to put people in the room, make them feel that they're in the negotiating room. so they can understand how negotiations happen and what makes them successful or unsuccessful.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable the number of people you interviewed in support and obviously in writing this book. I mean, it's just a star-studded group of people that you were able to connect with. Clearly, your relationships run wide and deep. And yes, you have the preface and then the introduction. You have Kissinger, you have Baker, and then many other players. Anybody really, frankly, who had consequential impact on American diplomacy over the end of the from basically from the Nixon administration forward, has a presence in place in your book. Let's pull the thread a little bit on that point you just made about this concern about isolationism, particularly it manifests in the Republican Party, certain pockets. It is quite clear from your book and the cases that you bring to light that the United States can lead diplomatically, can shape events, and it accrues to the benefit of U.S. interest. One of the things that the quote unquote neo-isolationist or restraint camp Stu emphasizes is, we need to take care of our borders first, or we need to take care of American interests first, right? This notion that somehow if we're engaged in the world at large, it's not necessarily accruing to the benefit of, the average American, the American people. And there is a bit of a tension point you hit on at various points in the book, certainly as it relates to Vietnam in terms of Kissinger's work, where if you don't get domestic politics right, Stu, then it can really undermine U.S. diplomacy. Like, you need to have that expertise, understanding. I think what made your diplomacy so effective is you always had a deep understanding, and I think both Baker and Kissinger emphasized this, of domestic policy. You were Carter's domestic policy advisor, so whatever you did on international fora, you had understanding of domestic policy. Talk about the importance of understanding domestic policy, Stu, and in America leading in international diplomacy.
Former Senator Vandenberg many decades ago talked about domestic politics should end at the water's edge, meaning that in foreign policy we ought to try to come together. What's happened recently, however, is that the sort of polarization and the cleavage that we have internally is translating into foreign policy and making it more difficult for us to have a united front when we confront opposition. A good example was the 6-month delay in getting funding for Ukraine, which put Ukraine in a very difficult position for its counteroffensive, which allowed Russia to dig in defensively and even to mount now its own offensive. And when we show ourselves to be unreliable by backing out of agreements, contrary to what Ronald Reagan did with SALT II, where he honored the SALT II nuclear agreement that Carter reached, even though they were political opponents, major political opponents, and SALT II had never been ratified. But he understood that it was a commitment made by the United States, made by an American president, and he honored it for the full term. And he built on it. He had the START talks, which were even deeper, but he did not abandon it. Contrast that with abandoning the 2015 JCPOA nuclear agreement with Iran, or what happens with climate change, where the politics domestically, depending on who is elected, dictate whether we're in or whether we're out, whether we're engaged with climate change or whether we back off. So you have to nurture domestic support. You can't just divorce domestic politics as much as one would like from foreign policy. It has to be, in the end, something that the American people support. Now, I think that they do give a president more leeway on foreign policy than they do in domestic areas. But still, if you don't have domestic support, you can't conclude things significantly in a positive way. In the end, that's what undid Vietnam.
Yeah, and that's a point that comes up early in your book when you're discussing Kissinger's negotiation diplomacy, which you point out really was a kind of masterful work on Kissinger's part, but ultimately He did not have the buy-in of the Congress, and Congress didn't fund the administration's request, and South Vietnam fell despite Kissinger's efforts. You make an interesting point about President Reagan and SALT II. It was a very competitive issue between the Carter administration and the Reagan campaign, and Reagan ran hard against it. And the fact that he complied, the administration complied, despite the treaty not being ratified by the U.S. Senate, is an interesting example, Stu. Do you think, though, that part of the problem that we've seen of late, the examples you point out with JCPOA, for example, the Obama administration agreement with Iran, was that it was done as an executive agreement? It was never intended to be something that the U.S. Senate would ratify as a treaty. And as a result, it really had was open season for the sorts of political back and forth that ultimately undercuts, I think, American diplomacy. I think that's the point you're making.
You're right, Roger, but this is a two-edged sword. Let me take you back to the Kyoto Protocols, which I negotiated for the U.S. on climate change in 1998. The question was, first, should we sign it? And second, should it be submitted to the Senate? Now, you could argue, well, if you really want buy-in domestically, you should submit it to the Senate. But we knew that if we submitted it to the Senate, it would be rejected. And so what's happened is increasingly presidents, because of the great difficulty of getting things ratified in the Senate by a 2/3 majority, do things by executive order. And yes, that is less legally binding on their successors, but it's oftentimes necessitated by the difficulty. The hardest battle we had in the Carter administration was in getting Senate ratification for the Panama Canal. Now, that was not done by executive order. It was done, and that's why it's lasted. It was damn difficult. I mean, to get a 2/3 majority, we didn't have but 15 or 18 votes when we started. And there were a number of things that helped, John Wayne included.
Well, that was one where Reagan lost to Carter, but you had Buckley on your side. So I think that's why part of the reason why you were successful.
So you do want to submit things to the Senate for ratification where you can, but when you know it's going to be defeated, then you have a choice. Do I just do nothing and say, well, if we don't get Senate ratification, we're not going to do anything? Or do you try to lock it in and over time show the Senate, show the public the benefits? Now, here again, with the JCPOA, there were tons of flaws with the JCPOA. The expiration date, it didn't cover missiles, but it did put a box for a good 10 to 15 years on the nuclear program of Iran. And so the hope is that you build trust. Another example of that, by the way, and here we were a mediator, not negotiating directly, was with the Good Friday Agreement. People don't realize it. The Good Friday Agreement did not resolve the two major issues which were at the forefront of the negotiation. Number one, what's the status of Northern Ireland? Is it going to be part of the Republic in the South or part of Great Britain? To this day, now we're talking about May 2024, it's never been resolved. But confidence was created by the agreement by breaking down literally walls between the Catholic and Protestant communities, and now they have a stake in a positive outcome. The same is true with one other element, and that is the decommissioning of arms by the militias, by the nationalist and unionist militias. It took 9 years after Good Friday for them to finally do so when they had enough confidence that they could live with each other. So one of the things you try to do oftentimes, and I use a baseball analogy, is you don't swing for a home run every time or you'll strike out. You try to get singles and doubles and then build confidence to go the next step.
Well, Stu, I thought you were a basketball player, so I would have used the basketball analogy. You want to put some points on the board. I don't know when you shifted to baseball, because I know you were a big Tar Heel back in the day, but we'll accept that for now. I guess you're going with Atlanta Braves instead of the North Carolina Tar Heels on that one. One of the things that you made me think of as you're making this point about incremental progress. And I take the example with the Good Friday agreement is it ultimately can lead to even more progress. You need to have some framework to work with. I was thinking about, well, we really don't have many examples of that today. And I think a big difference between your years in the Clinton administration, or even going to your time in the Carter administration, is that we're now in a period where we have these adversaries, these emerging, peer competitors in China and Russia, where the conflict, is playing out in lots of different ways, but we really don't have a framework for dealing with them. I don't know if you subscribe to the new Cold War kind of analogy, but it seems to me if you adopt that analogy, we're kind of in the early period where the lines haven't really kind of settled yet, and as a result, it may not offer the opportunities for diplomacy that perhaps the later period in the Cold War that were available. I mean, I always think it's interesting that during the Carter administration, I don't know if you view it this way, Stu, they actually thought that the Cold War was a thing of the past, that it was, the Cold War was what we saw during the Kennedy administration, parts of the Johnson administration, but we didn't want to return to the Cold War with some of the language that was used during the Carter administration. That period perhaps lends itself to more diplomacy, détente of the kind that was engaged in. Do we really have that opportunity today, given the way we see these revanchist powers, these new authoritarians organizing and challenging, the American-led order?
Well, let's remember, it's a very good point. Let's remember that, again, in terms of diplomacy, one of the key reasons why Nixon and Kissinger reached out to China to open relations, they didn't formalize diplomatic relations because of the power of the Taiwan lobby. We did in the Carter administration. But the reason that we continued that process was because we wanted to separate the Soviet Union from China. We wanted to bring China more into a neutral orbit. Now, unfortunately, they're tied together. And what diplomacy to me means today is to find ways in which we can work, particularly with China, on trade and climate change and other pandemics and other things, so that they're not inexorably part of the Soviet or now Russian bloc. Russia is a much more difficult area because of Ukraine. So there is still room for creativity. We just have to find areas. What I would have done the very first day of the Biden administration is I would have removed the $200 billion in tariffs that President Trump put on China's goods, which have only increased cost to Americans, have not resulted in any greater opening to China, and are still there as we speak.
Yeah, it's actually, Stu, trade is one of the areas of continuity in terms of trade policy between the Trump administration and Biden administration. It's quite interesting, and there's competition between President Biden and President Trump right now over who would levy more tariffs on the PRC. So that's an interesting point in some ways. So much of what you did while you were in government in the Clinton administration was expanding free trade. We've seen this kind of reversal in terms of free trade agreements, certainly multilateral free trade agreements in the years since, both during the Trump administration, now during the Biden administration, even when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running against one another. Of course, they both argued against the Pacific Trade Treaty. So, that sort of diplomacy, I think, is also, I'd love for you to comment. It comes up at the end of your book. Seems to be not perhaps a thing of the past, or certainly something that is counter where both President Biden and President Trump are going on trade policy.
Well, trade is a perfect example. In fact, it's the most relevant example of the impact of domestic political views on international agreements, because it's so heavily economic in its orientation. It's not national security in the traditional sense. And what's happened is that there is a protectionist mood in the American public, the sense that the plant closings that occurred in the Middle West are the result of trade rather than technology, which I think has proven to be incorrect, but that's the perception. And so we now are in a situation, as you say, in which the trade policy of the Biden administration is almost indistinguishable from that of the Trump administration. Both are heavily protectionist. No, not one new market access agreement in the Biden administration. I mean, at least in the Trump administration, and I interviewed Bob Lighthizer as well as Mickey Cantor and others who were involved in what was the now USMCA, the NAFTA. At least there, you did have some market opening.
Yeah, right. President Trump famously wanted to make NAFTA better, and he created the U.S. Mexico Canada trade agreement, which was very similar to NAFTA with, updates and a few changes. But that's an
Yes,
interesting point. You're not seeing that in the Biden administration at all.
not at all. And we talk about a pivot to Asia, about combating China and Asia, but what have we done? We've ceded the whole trade arena to China. And many of our allies now in the region have joined the Chinese version of a trade agreement, which has none of the standards that the Trans Pacific Partnership had, with higher environmental standards, higher labor standards. It's now China, which is the magnet for much of the trade. So any real effort for us to compete with China in Asia is blunted by the fact that we don't have an aggressive trade policy.
I think take your point and you make it in the last section of the book that domestic politics really has this direct link to trade policy, and it's of course the domestic politics which drove someone like Hillary Clinton to come out against that free trade agreement, right? Which of course was counter to where she was when she was a sitting U.S. senator, and where of course the Clinton administration was, which of course you led and know well. Is that a failure of domestic politics? Is that a failure in presidents and their administrations to lead on this? Diplomacy and negotiation only happens if there's political space that elected leaders create. And of course, as you just outlined, there isn't much space left anymore, whether you're looking in the Republican side, in the conservative camp, or on the Democratic side.
So, Rager, traditionally, and I can say this being part for 8 years of the Clinton administration, where we did a lot of free trade agreements, Central America, Latin America, the African nations with the so-called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. What we had to do to get Congress to approve is we got a majority of Republicans, which have traditionally been a free trade party, and a minority of Democrats, because with the labor union base for the Democratic Party, there's always been a lot of resistance within the party to free trade agreements. So we had to rely on Republican votes and indeed Republican majorities to get these initiatives done. Now, President Trump, former President Trump, has converted the Republican Party into a protectionist party. And so the votes don't exist on either side. And it's only a tiny sliver of either party that remains committed to open trade, free trade, and greater market access.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't agree that it's a protectionist party, but you're no doubt there are increasing number of congressmen in the House and senators that would oppose free trade agreements. But again, they're not even being proposed by the executive. They're not even being worked. Now, perhaps it's a function of the politics. They know they can't get through the Congress, but they're running on that as well. It's interesting. Stu, I want to go back to the discussion we were having earlier about China and Russia and the analogy with the Cold War. And you write about how Kissinger, working with Nixon, opened up the conversation with China, of course, that was formally recognized during the Carter administration. Today, we have BRICS, right? Which is where you have Brazil and Russia, India, China, in this alternative group of nations that are really challenging Western interests and the American led alliance. How would you go about the challenge of dealing with BRICS in the current security and kind of international security environment?
So the old Cold War division between the West and democracy and the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc is totally shattered with, of course, the end of communism. But instead of being, as was famously said, the end of history, it was the beginning of a new history. And that new history is shown, as you well said, by the so-called BRIC nations. These are nations that are emerging countries. India is a perfect example. It's the largest country in the world now, exceeding China, and will do so as China's population shrinks. It's feeling its oats. And what's relevant about the BRIC countries is they don't want to be caught up in a choice between China and the United States. They don't want that kind of posture. They don't want to be put into that kind of a Cold War type box. And so, what we have to do to have our influence is much more transactional diplomacy. We have to find areas where we can agree, for example, on clean energy, where India, Brazil, now with its new president on deforestation, is very interested. And we can't try to force them to make a choice between China and the United States. We have to show the value of being part of our world. And one of the instruments, again, we'll come back to trade, is the one thing that those countries all want is access to the US market. Now, for sure, it shouldn't be for free. We should get something in return. Agricultural concessions, which India has always been very difficult for, but we've got to bring things to the table. We can't just rhetorically say, we're great, we're democratic, we're free, you should like our model more than the autocratic model.
Yeah, and no doubt the Indo-Pacific offers great opportunities there. As you think about, I mean, it seems to me China's doing probably a lot to advance U.S. bilateral relationships with countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, with the way that it's asserting itself.
Also, Roger, Africa. I mean, President Biden did have a fairly recent summit with over 50 African leaders. And that's very important. I mean, this is going to be a tremendous market. It's also critical minerals for our solar industry and for our renewable energy, titanium and things like that. So we have an interest in working with Africa as well. But there again is going to be a very difficult trade-off because many of the African countries are autocracies. They're not pure democracies. And we can't write them off purely by saying, you don't follow our democratic model, therefore we don't want to deal with you. We have to find other ways in which we engage with them and hope over time that our influence can help on the rule of law and on human rights and on environment.
Yeah, and there's no doubt there have been, if you move outside trade agreements, and creating market access, where there has been little, if anything, to show of late. You have had security agreements, though, where the sort of diplomacy and negotiation that you write about seems to be at play. The AUKUS agreement has been very consequential between the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, which deals as a security agreement and a technology agreement, really aimed at countering China's expansion in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, in the midst of the war in Gaza and following Hamas's attack on October 7th, there was Israel and the United States and Saudi Arabia on the precipice of a very consequential security agreement. It's possible that is actually in play and will be perhaps a piece of some sort of deal that closes out the war in Gaza. Perhaps talk about those efforts, and if that, to what extent it reflects some of the negotiation and diplomacy that you write about in your book in terms of
I
what we
will,
need
but
more
let
of?
me just start by saying that it's very important to understand that international negotiations and diplomacy are not a poker game where one side wins and takes all the chips and the other side loses. They have to be win-win situations. And therefore, you've got to craft your positions in such a way as to convince the other country that it's in their interest to do what will be in your interest. And that's where diplomacy comes in. It requires fierce determination to succeed, grabbing the moment, as George Bush did when the wall came down. It requires political courage, like Sadat showed in going to Jerusalem, or MBZ in doing the Abraham Accords under President Trump. It requires preparation and really hard homework, as Bob Lighthizer, Trump's trade representative, mentioned. It requires the skill of listening to the other side. What are they saying? How are they saying it? Putting yourself in their shoes and using what Larry Summers, when I was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury and he was the Secretary, called unsympathetic empathy. It requires developing personal relationships. And a perfect example of that I use in the book is Jim Baker trying to get the Soviet Union to accept a unified Germany within NATO. And he did it by establishing a very personal relationship with Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, by taking him to Jackson Hole, where he had a lodge for 3 days, and they established a kind of personal rapport that allowed Shevardnadze to make agreements that his own foreign ministry would have opposed. It requires creativity, like George Mitchell showed in the Good Friday Agreement, using negative and positive leverage, and also stamina. These are all long negotiations that take sometimes years, and they end like a marathon in a sprint. And you look at Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, where for 2 weeks he shuttled, well, no sleep, between Syria, Egypt, and Israel.
During the Yom Kippur War, yes.
Yes, and where at Camp David, Carter got almost no sleep. At Kyoto, when I was doing climate change, where we got almost no sleep. So it requires a mixture of those skills. Now, in moving to the current conflicts in Gaza and in Ukraine, there are a number of lessons to be learned. If I may start with Ukraine, Kissinger said to me, and he's repeated in other contexts, that the outcome on the battlefield will always determine the course of negotiations. You can't achieve at the negotiating table what you haven't earned on the battlefield. This terrible war in Europe, the worst since World War II, will end when both sides believe they can't achieve diplomatically anything more militarily. That's why it's critical that we resupply Ukraine with the most sophisticated equipment, that we do it promptly, that we give them the opportunity to recover as much of their territory as they can. But we have to realize that they're not going to get it all back,
You
as
know,
much as we might like.
a quick intervention on that, because you have a great example of this point in your discussion of military force and diplomacy, where Clark and Holbrooke were with Milosevic as we're dealing with the Bosnia War, and you quote them saying that Milosevic said, "Hey, you guys have to stop the bombing. It's bad for peace." This is Milosevic speaking to the Americans. And I think Holbrooke, you have quoted, responded, "No, actually, the bombing is good for peace. You're the one that can stop the bombing by stopping what's going on in Bosnia." It was a great reflection of how seasoned diplomats need to understand the place of use of force in the context
Exactly.
of diplomacy.
Exactly.
It
They have
sounds
to
like
be
you are making
married.
a similar point on Ukraine.
I am. They have to be married. And it's important to do 2 or 3 things when the time for negotiation comes. Number one, we should not negotiate behind Zelensky's back, as we did in resolving the Vietnam War with North Korea, but without the government of South Korea, as we did in Afghanistan, negotiating with Taliban without having the government we were fighting 20 years for in the tables. This has to, in the end, be their decision. But we're obviously supplying money and arms, and we have to say to them, there is a time when it will be necessary to negotiate. But here's what's also critical. You know, there's an old proverb, Roger, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So if you look at what Ukraine has a right to insist on at the end of the day, in 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, Russia and Ukraine agreed that Ukraine would give up its third largest nuclear arsenal in return for a commitment by Russia that it wouldn't violate Ukraine's territorial integrity. They did over Crimea. Then, in the so-called Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015, to end the fighting in the very area they're still fighting in now, in the Donbass, this time we signed, we, the United States of America, agreed with Russia, with Ukraine, with the UK, that Russia would not violate Ukrainians' territory by force. It's written. Well, what happened? What happened was 3 days before the invasion, February 24th, 2022, Putin said, quote unquote, Minsk no longer exists. So, in order to have any durable peace, as we now have in Bosnia and in Kosovo, you have to have some kind of security backup. So Putin can't simply rest and reload. Now, I want to take you back to something that actually came to me after the book, and that is I don't think there's going to be a formal treaty of peace. What there can be is something like the 1953 Korean War Armistice Agreement, in which we had a demilitarized zone separating the North and the South. Now, that is not real peace, that's true, but we've had no fighting for 70 years. Similarly, the Turkish invasion of northern Cyprus in 1974 didn't really end up in a peace agreement. It ended up, in effect, in a ceasefire. So that may be the way in which we deal with this, but we can also say to Ukraine, we will not recognize the Russian control over this territory, nor will we relax sanctions.
Yeah, those are interesting analogies. And the Korea one, especially frozen conflict as it is. At the same time, what's kept or prevented conflict on the peninsula, of course, has been significant U.S. footprint since, and one that the United States has committed a tremendous amount of treasure as well to demonstrate and to deter North Korea. Although the outcome has been a flourishing Republic of Korea, I mean, South Korea,
Yes, but I'll tell you, Roger,
democracy
in,
and
in the
economy.
in the 1976 presidential campaign, and I was Carter's policy director before going into the White House, he said that he was going to withdraw U.S. troops and nuclear forces from South Korea. As soon as he got into the office and realized the reality of what that would mean, he certainly reversed it.
Yeah, interesting anecdote that in terms of what President Carter thought he was going to do, and then what what happens when you get those classified briefings and you see what it looks like from the perspective of a commander in chief. That's a fascinating case. Let's move on to your take on the war in Gaza and Hamas. Also, a conflict that does not. It's not going to seem amenable to negotiation. Of course, here we're not dealing with a state actor. You're dealing with a terrorist organization. What do you see happening there? The U.S. role, my own view is the U.S. has taken on the role of too much of trying to be like a mediator. And when you're dealing with a terrorist organization that's killed over 40 Americans and holds 5 Americans hostage, that the U.S. should be taking a more forceful role. And actually, that probably could yield some diplomatic gains or perhaps
Yes,
release
and
of
you
hostages.
wrote a really brilliant, and I'm not gilding the lily, a really brilliant op-ed piece in the Washington Post on just that point.
Well, thank you,
So
Stu. So I'm curious to get your take on what the U.S. posture should be.
so it should be the following. Number one, to support Israel in recognizing that Hamas must be disabled as both a military and governing force, that no country can tolerate having a terrorist government cheek to jowl on its border, committed not to a two-state solution, not to a diplomatic solution, but to its own elimination. That's a given. But second, that Hamas cannot ultimately be defeated without a diplomatic and political component. And here's what I mean by that. That Israel would be best served in terms of its ultimate security by recognizing it needs to be part of a coalition of countries in the region, which the US and the European Union can certainly play a part in, but with the moderate Sunni Arab states opposing the Iranian-led axis of resistance with Syria, with Hamas, with the Houthis, with Hezbollah. And of course, they're the chief arms funders. They help convert Hamas from a terrorist group into a terrorist army. And Israel, as a price for that, is going to have to do something to convince those moderate countries that there is a political perspective at the end of the day for the Palestinians, for the nonviolent Palestinians. And that is something at this point that's still not there, it's still missing. Now, Israel.
And you make a note, Stu, that you feel because Israel has not done that, it's not only, of course, not allowed, kind of impeded its ability to conclude the war to its satisfaction, but also we haven't seen the expansion of the Abraham Accords, which I got you referencing the possibility of Saudi Arabia.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the greatest security Israel can have is to have Saudi Arabia, the sort of principal Arab country, have a normalized relationship with Israel. And it was in weeks, I think, of doing so before October 7th, and embedding Israel into this moderate coalition of countries. Yes, they have a common enemy in Iran, but greater trade. I mean, the trade between the UAE, Roger, and Israel in just over 2 years of the Abraham Accords is over $2 billion with a country of only 7, 8, 9 million people. And so having that kind of integration, technology transfer will be tremendously important, but it cannot happen without a political dimension. Now, here are mistakes that I think were made. They failed to recognize the intelligence failures that we had over Iraq. So, for example, here they were cheek to jaw with Iran, with Hamas, and they failed to understand that in just 2 or 3 years, Hamas had converted itself from being a sort of ragtag terrorist group into a highly disciplined 30 to 40,000 person armed force with very sophisticated arms, with 300 miles of tunnels, some 80 meters deep. That was missed. Also, they made the mistake of not building up the more moderate Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, depriving it of tax monies which they had collected, and allowing Qatar to provide $500 million of funding for Hamas, thinking somehow they could domesticate Hamas. And then last mistake that we made in Iraq and the second Iraq war under George W. Bush, and which I think in a very revealing passage I have in my book, Steve Hadley mentions, which is not planning before you shoot the first bullet on what the political outcome is you're going to try to achieve and is it achievable, and then building the military plan around that. And there's still no post-war plan for the governance. Now, General Petraeus, who I interviewed twice, said that what turned Iraq around was a threefold policy: clear an area from terrorists, hold that area so they can't come back, but third, build the area so that you give the non-combatants, the civilians, a better way of life. And that has to be a clear part of it. He had a sign in his office, Roger, that said, "What have you done to help Iraqi civilians today?" That's something we must be thinking about. And it's crucial that there therefore be a diplomatic component to the military defeat of Hamas.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the question of how a counterinsurgency strategy, which of course General Petraeus famously applied to Iraq, its relevance and application in Gaza is an open question, and whether or not the Netanyahu government would be open to the Palestinian Authority taking on kind of control.
Where they're not at this point. They're
And
clearly
they are not. And so in the absence of the PA having that role, it is an open question for the Netanyahu government, who's going to be the civilian entity to govern Gaza. And I agree with you. In the absence of that, it's going to be hard for Israel to move on. And Gaza will continue to be a challenge. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Remember that General Gantz, who is part of the war cabinet, moving from opposition, has said that if there's no such post-war plan, by June 8th, he's leaving the cabinet. Now, that doesn't mean the government falls. He's not part of the coalition. But it is a sign that serious Israelis, and you can't fault him on the security angle at all, realize that there's got to be a diplomatic component to this as well.
Absolutely. We got a few minutes left. We're with Stu Eizenstat, Ambassador Stu Eizenstat, author of The Art of Diplomacy, How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World, lessons that diplomats today would be wise to internalize. Stu, before we get to our lightning round, I had two more things I wanted to raise with you. One is something that is not in the book, certainly in terms of attention to discussion, I want to get your take on. And then another item of dealing with kind of just present day challenges. George Schultz, Secretary of State for President Reagan for about 7 years, almost 7 years of his presidency, of course, led the negotiations for President Reagan with the Soviets. And of course, President Reagan and Gorbachev famously signed the INF Treaty and began arms control reduction. Give us your take about what place that has in the art of diplomacy and President Reagan's legacy and Schultz's legacy in terms of advancing it and really opening the door for President H.W. Bush and Jim Baker post the Reagan presidency.
So I want to go back, and I'm going to answer it directly, but I want to give credit where credit is due. All the reversal of post-Vietnam defense reductions, all the weapon systems which President Reagan introduced, the cruise missile, the stealth bomber, the MX missile, the intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, all of those were green-lighted and started by President Carter. So there was a continuity there, which he deserves credit for and hasn't received. Now, clearly, President Reagan doing it, enhancing it, and Gorbachev himself has said was a factor in the erosion of the Soviet Union. It was a realization they could not match U.S. spending and U.S. sophistication in arms. And it's a perfect example that you don't have to use military force as a fighting force. You can use the buildup of military, the fence systems that you set up, the threat that if harm comes, you can use it. President Clinton did that with Haiti to get the dictator out. But President Reagan and George Shultz, who was a great Secretary of State, really talked about peace through strength. And that is an incredibly important part of diplomacy. It gives diplomacy a force that it wouldn't have without it. It's not just empty promises, it's backed up by real action. So I think they deserve great credit. It's not just his famous statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's the fact that he backed up his policy following President Carter's buildup with enhanced, but he did two things also in addition. In addition to the military buildup, Roger, he also entered into arms control agreements with the Soviets, oftentimes forgotten.
Yeah, no doubt, and it was reduction was his emphasis, right? Because I think he was generally in agreement that an arms reduction agreement was preferable to an arms control agreement, which kind of kept the status quo. Let's move to the lightning round with Ambassador Stu Eizenstat. Fantastic guest. Congrats on your book. Here's where we ask our guests to share their favorite Reagan book, speech, and quote. Maybe the first time I've asked someone who served in the Carter administration to share their lightning round recommendations.
Well, first of all, that prepared Jimmy Carter, or was one of the key people preparing him for his debate in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. And by the way, Jim Baker admitted in my Carter book and here again that the campaign manager, and I don't think Reagan was involved in this, actually stole one of our debate books. But one of the great lines that turned the debate around was when Carter was blaming Reagan for opposing Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And Reagan said, with that chuckle and shake of his head, "There you go again." And that was a devastating retort. Second, he was a great master of using the presidency as a bully pulpit. President Carter was not good at that. And using it as a bully pulpit to get his views across, some of which I certainly disagreed with, particularly domestically, but doing so in a very persuasive way. Third was the use of symbolism. Now, here, George H.W. Bush, when the wall actually fell, made a very important decision not to dance on that wall as it was destroyed. He was advised by his political advisors, "This is great, beat your chest, we did it, we won." And he said, "Look, we have to live with the Soviet Union. We want a reunited Germany in NATO. If we humiliate the Soviet Union, we'll never get it." But preceding that, Reagan's famous statement, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev," was a way of saying that we, the United States, are leading a free and open world. And you, Mr. Gorbachev, are leading a closed, cloistered, autocratic world. And he made it a very clear choice with those very, dramatic words. So in that case, it was very much called for. But what happened when the wall actually did fall and George H.W. Bush came in was also correct, not to gloat, but to look at the longer run and say, how do we make something out of this? How do we seize this moment with diplomacy? And this was also a very wise and not politically easy decision. Likewise, let's go to Iraq, the difference between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. So with Iraq, George H.W. Bush did everything right. He got UN Security Council support for the use of force. He had a 38-country coalition. He got congressional support. And he had a limited political objective, which they agreed on, Roger, before the first bullet, which was simply get Saddam out of Kuwait. And remember that when he had Saddam on the run, he and Colin Powell were criticized greatly.
We're not going to Baghdad.
We're not going to Baghdad. And Colin Powell said, if we go to Baghdad, we own it. Well, we did own it in Bush too. And so I think that sometimes wisdom means not pursuing an advantage and recognizing that you settle for something that is more achievable. This is where, again, I'll use a basketball analogy, not going for a three-point shot at the end, but using a layup.
There we go. Stu Eizenstat, congratulations, The Art of Diplomacy, and thank you for sharing your insight on American diplomacy, on Reaganism. We look forward to much success on the book and having you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.